Hi, this is the History and Mythology channel, and we talk a mysterious people and kingdom from the early Middle Ages, the Khazars. They were such a historical enigma that in 1984, Serbian, or back then Yugoslavian writer Milorad Pavic dedicated his mystery novel Khazarian Dictionary to that curious people of the past. The Khazar Khaganate was one of the first steppe empires in Eurasian history, a kingdom ruled by a Turkic-speaking elite with nomadic past. The most curious fact about that realm is that its rulers adopted as their religion Judaism, the otherwise closed national creed of the Jewish or Hebrew people. There were few non-Jewish polities adopting this faith throughout human history. In this, as in many other respects, the Khazars differed from most of the kingdoms of the Near and Middle East, Caucasus, and the Eurasian steppes. The tribes that were to comprise the Khazar Empire were not an ethnic union, but a confederacy of steppe nomads and peoples who came to be subordinated and subscribed to a core Turkic leadership. Many Turkic groups, such as the Ogurik people, including Sharagur, Ogur, Onugur, and Bulgar, who earlier formed part of the Tieli Confederation, are attested quite early, having been driven west by the Sabirs, who in turn fled the Asian Avars and began to flow in the Volga-Caspian Pontic zone from as early as the 4th century AD, and are recorded by Priscus, the Roman writer, to reside in the western Eurasian steppe lands as early as the year 463. They appear to stem from Mongolia and South Siberia in the aftermath of the fall of the Hunnic or Sunnu nomadic polity, a variated tribal federation led by these proto-Turks, probably comprising a complex assortment of Iranian, Proto-Mongolic, Uralic and Paleo-Siberian clans, vanquished the Rauran Kaganate of the hegemonic Central Asian Avars in the year 552 and swept westwards, taking in their train other steppe nomads and peoples from Sogdiana. The ruling family of this confederation may have hailed from the Ashina clan of the Western Turkic Khaganate. Chinese and Arabic reports in this matter are almost identical, making the connection a strong one, and conjectures that their leader may have been Yubshekwi, who lost power or was killed around 651. Moving west, the confederation reached the land of the Akadziri, who had been important allies of Byzantium in fighting off Attila's army. An initial polity of Khazaria began to form sometime after the year 630, when it emerged from the breakdown of the larger Göktürk Khaganate. Göktürk armies had penetrated the Volga by 549, ejecting the Avars, who were then forced to flee to the sanctuary of the Hungarian plain westwards. The Ashina clan appeared on the scene by 552, when they overthrew the Raurans and established the Göktürk Khaganate, whose self-designation was Türk. By 568, these Göktürks were probing for an alliance with Byzantium to attack Persia. An internecine war broke out between the senior Eastern Göktürks and the junior West Turkic Khaganate some decades later, when, on the death of Taspar Khagan, a succession dispute led to a dynastic crisis between Taspar's chosen heir, the Apa Khagan, and the ruler appointed by the tribal high council, Ashina Shetu, the Ishbara Khagan. By the first decades of the 7th century, the Ashina Yabgutong managed to stabilize the western division, but upon his death, after providing crucial military assistance to Byzantium in routing the Sassanid army in the Persian heartland, the western Turkic Khaganate dissolved under pressure from the encroaching Tang dynasty armies and split in two competing federations, each consisting of 5 tribes, collectively known as the 10 Aros, on Ok in Proto-Turkic. Both briefly challenged Tang hegemony in eastern Turkestan. To the west, the two nomadic states arose in the meantime: Old Greater Bulgaria under Kubrat, the Dulu clan leader, and the Nishibi subconfederation, also consisting of 5 tribes. The Dulu challenged the Avars in the Kuban River Sea or Azov area, while the Khazar Khaganate consolidated further westwards, led apparently by an Ashina dynasty. With a resounding victory over the tribes in 657, engineered by General Su Dinfang, Tang Chinese overlordship was imposed to their east after a final mop-up operation in 659, but the two confederations of Bulgars and Khazars fought for supremacy on the western steppe land, and with the ascendancy of the latter, the former either succumbed to Khazar rule or, as under Asparuh, Kubrat's son, shifted even further west across the Danube to lay the foundations of the First Bulgar Empire in the Balkans, around the year 680. The Khazar Khaganate thus took shape out of the ruins of this nomadic empire as it broke up under pressure from the Tang Chinese dynasty armies to the east sometime between 630 and 650, after their conquest of the lower Volga region to the east and an area westwards between the Danube and the Dnieper, and their subjugation of the Onogur-Bulgar Union sometime around 670, a properly constituted Khazar Khaganate emerged, becoming the westernmost successor state of the formidable Göktürk Khaganate after its disintegration. According to historian Omelian Pritsak, the language of the Onogur-Bulgar Federation was to become the lingua franca of Khazaria as it developed into what historian Lev Gumilyov called a steppe Atlantis, Stepnaya Atlantida. Historians have often referred to this period of Khazar domination as the Pax Khazarica, since the state became an international trading hub permitting Western Eurasian merchants safe transit across it to pursue their business without interference. The high status soon to be accorded this empire to the north is attested by Ibn al-Balhi's Farsnama, circa 1100, which relates that the Sasanian Shah Khusroy I, Anushirvan, placed 3 thrones by his own, one for the Emperor of China, a second one for the Emperor of Byzantium, and a third one for the King of the Khazars. Although anachronistic in retrodating the Khazars to this period, the legend in placing the Khazar Khagan on a throne with equal status to kings of other 2 superpowers of the world back then bears witness to the reputation won by the Khazars from early times. Khazaria and the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine diplomatic policy towards the steppe peoples generally consisted of encouraging them to fight among themselves. The Pechenegs provided great assistance to the Byzantines in the 9th century in exchange for regular payments. Byzantium also sought alliances with the Göktürks against common enemies. In the early 7th century, one such alliance was brokered with the Western Turks against the Persian Sasanians in the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602-628. The Byzantines called Khazaria Turkiya, and by the 9th century referred to the Khazars as Turks. During the period leading up to and after the siege of Constantinople in 626, Emperor Heraclius sought help via emissaries and eventually personally from a Göktürk chieftain of the Western Turkey Khaganate, Tong Yabgu Khagan, in Tiflis, or Tbilisi, modern Georgia, plying him with gifts and the promise of marriage to one of his daughters, Epiphania. Tong Yabgu responded by sending a large force to ravage the Persian Empire, marking the start of the Third Perso-Turkic War. A joint Byzantine-Turk operation breached the Caspian Gates and sacked Derbent in 627. Together, Byzantines and Proto-Khazars then besieged Tiflis, where the Byzantines may have deployed an early variety of traction trebuchets, Helepolis, to breach the walls. After the campaign, Tong Yabgu is reported, perhaps with some exaggeration, to have left some 40,000 troops behind with Emperor Heraclius. Although occasionally identified with the Khazars, the Göktürk identification is more probable since the Khazars only emerged from that group after the fragmentation of the former sometime after 630. Some scholars argued that Sasanian Persia never recovered from the devastating defeat wrought by this invasion. The dual kingship of Khazaria. The Khazarian Khaganate developed a dual kingship governance structure, typical among Turkic nomads, consisting of a Shad or Bek and a Khagan. The emergence of this system may be deeply entwined with the conversion to Judaism as well. According to Arabic sources, the lesser king or the steward was called Isha, and the greater king Khazar Khagan. The former managed and commanded the military, while the greater one was primarily a sacred figure, less concerned with daily affairs. The greater king was recruited from the Khazar house of notables, Al-Bayt Ma'rufin, and in an initiation ritual was nearly strangled until he declared the number of years he wished to live and reign, and on the expiration he would be killed by the nobles in a sacred king slaughter. The deputy ruler would enter the presence of the reclusive greater king only with great ceremony, approaching him barefoot to prostrate himself in the dust, and then light a piece of wood as a purifying fire, while waiting humbly and calmly to be summoned. Particularly elaborate rituals accompanied a royal burial. At one period, travelers had to dismount, bow before the ruler's tomb, and then walk away on foot. Subsequently, the charismatic sovereign's burial place was hidden from view, with a palatial structure, a so-called paradise, constructed and then hidden under rerouted river waters to avoid disturbance by evil spirits and later generations. Such a royal burial ground, a kuruk, is typical of Inner Asian peoples. Both the Isha and the Kagan converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th century, while the rest of the country, according to the Persian traveler Ahmad ibn Rustan, probably followed the old Turkic religion. The ruling stratum of Khazaria, like that of the later Chingizids within the Golden Horde, was a relatively small group that differed ethnically and linguistically from its subject peoples, meaning the Alans and Oghuric Turkic tribes who were numerically superior within Khazaria. The Khazar Khagans, while taking wives and concubines from the subjected populations, were protected by a Khwarezmian guard corps, or comitatus, called the Ursiya. Unlike many other local polities, they hired soldiers, they used mercenaries, the Junnut Murtasika in Al-Masudi's works. At the peak of their empire, the Khazars ran a centralized fiscal administration with a standing army of some 7,000 to 12,000 men, which could at need be multiplied 2 or 3 times that number by inducting reserves from their nobles' retinues. Other figures for the permanent standing army indicate that it numbered as many as 100,000. They controlled and exacted tribute from 25 to 30 different nations and tribes inhabiting the vast territories between the Caucasus, the Aral Sea, the Ural Mountains and the Ukrainian steppe. Khazar armies were led by the Kagan Bek and commanded by subordinate officers known as Tarkan. When the Bek sent out a body of troops, they would not retreat under any circumstances. If they were defeated, everyone who returned was executed. Settlements were governed by administrative officials known as Tudun. In some cases, such as the Byzantine settlements in southern Crimea, a Tudun would be appointed from a town nominally within another polity's sphere of influence. Other officials in the Khazar government included dignitaries referred to by Arab writer Ibn Fadlan as Joshingur and Kundur, but their responsibilities are unknown. Although the Khazar kingdom was not entirely destroyed by Kievan Princess Sviatoslav's campaign, but might have lingered on until 1224 when the Mongols invaded the Rus, by most accounts, the Rus-Oghuz campaigns left Khazaria devastated, with perhaps many Khazarian Jews in flight and leaving behind at best a minor rump state. It left little trace except for some place names, and much of its population was undoubtedly absorbed in successor hordes. Arabian writer Al-Muqaddasi, writing circa 985, mentions Khazars beyond the Caspian Sea as a district of woe and squalor, with honey, many sheep and Jews. Byzantine writer Skilica Kedrinos mentions a joint Rus-Byzantine attack on Khazaria in 1016, which defeated its ruler Georgius Tsul. This name suggests Christian affiliations. The account concludes by saying that after Tsul's defeat, the Khazar ruler of Upper Media, Sennacherib, had to sue for peace and submission. In 1024, Mstislav of Chernigov, one of Vladimir's sons, marched against his brother Yaroslav with an army that included Khazars and Kasogians, in a repulsed attempt to restore a kind of Khazarian-type dominion over Kiev. Arabian writers Ibn al-Athir's mention of a raid of Fadlun the Kurd against the Khazars in 1030, in which 10,000 of these men were vanquished by the latter, has been taken as a reference to such a Khazar remnant state, but Bartolt identifies this Fadlun as Fadl ibn Muhammad and the Khazars as either Georgians or rather Abkhazians. A Kievan prince named Oleg, grandson of Yaroslav, was reportedly kidnapped by Khazars in 1079 and shipped off to Constantinople, although most scholars believe that this is a reference to the Cumans or Kipchaks or other steppe peoples then dominant in the Pontic region. Upon his conquest of Tmutarkan in the 1080s, Oleg gave himself the title Archon of Khazaria. In 1083, Oleg is said to have exacted revenge on the Khazars after his brother Roman was killed by their allies, the Polovtsi, or Cumans. After one more conflict with these Polovtsi in 1106, the Khazars fade from history. By the 13th century, they survived in Russian folklore only as Jewish characters in the land of the Jews, Zemlya Zhidovskaya. By the end of the 12th century, Petahia of Ratisbon reported traveling through what he called Khazaria and had little to remark on other than describing its sectaries living amidst desolation in perpetual mourning. The reference seems to be to the Karaites. The Franciscan missionary Guillaume de Rubruck likewise found only impoverished pastures in the Lower Volga area where the Khazar capital of Itil once lay. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, the papal legate to the court of the Mongol Khan Gyuyuk at that time, mentioned an otherwise unattested Jewish tribe, the Brutahi, perhaps in the Volga region. Although connections are made to the Khazars, the link is based merely on a common attribution of Judaism. The 10th century Zoroastrian author Denkert registered the collapse of Khazar power in attributing its eclipse to the enfeebling effects of false religion. This decline was contemporary to that suffered by the Transoxiana Samanid Empire to the east, both events paving the way for the rise of the Great Seljuk Empire, whose founding traditions mention Khazar connections. Whatever successor entity survived, it could no longer function as a bulwark against the pressure east and south of nomad expansions. By 1043, Kimeks and Kipchaks, thrusting westwards, pressured the Augusturks, who in turn pushed the Pechenegs west toward Byzantium's Balkan provinces. It was really a falling house of cards. The Khazar state was not the only Jewish state to rise between the fall of the Second Temple in 67 to 70 AD and the establishment of Israel, the modern state, in 1948. A state in Yemen also adopted Judaism in the 4th century, lasting until the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The Khazar kingdom is said to have stimulated messianic aspirations for a return to Israel as early as Yudah HaLevi, in the time of the Egyptian vizier Al-Afdal Shahanshah, who died in 1121, one Solomon ben Duji, often identified as a Khazarian Jew, attempted to advocate for a messianic effort for the liberation of and return of all Jews to Palestine. He wrote to many Jewish communities to enlist support. He eventually moved to Kurdistan, where his son Menachem, some decades later, assumed the title of Messiah, and raising an army for this purpose, took the fortress of Ahmadiyya north of Mosul, in modern Iraq. His project was opposed by the rabbinical authorities and he was poisoned in his sleep. One theory maintains that the Star of David, until then a decorative motif or magical emblem, began to assume its national value in late Jewish tradition from its earlier symbolic use by Menachem. The word Khazar, as an ethnonym, was last used in the 13th century by people in the North Caucasus believed to practice Judaism. The nature of a hypothetical Khazar diaspora, Jewish or otherwise, is disputed. Abraham ibn Dawood mentions encountering rabbinical students descended from Khazars as far away as Toledo, Spain, in the 1160s. Khazar communities persisted here and there. Many Khazar mercenaries served in the armies of the Islamic caliphates and other states. Documents from medieval Constantinople attest to a Khazar community mingled with the Jews of the suburb of Pera. Khazar merchants were active in both Constantinople and Alexandria in the 12th century. The religions of the Khazars. Tengrism. Direct sources for the Khazar religion are not many, but in all likelihood they originally engaged in a traditional Turkic form of religious practices known as Tengrism, which focused on the sky god, Tengri. Something of its nature may be deduced from what we know of the rites and beliefs of contiguous tribes, such as the North Caucasian Huns. Horse sacrifices were made to this supreme deity. Rites involved offerings to fire, water and the moon, to remarkable creatures and to gods of the road. Confer Old Turk Yol Tengri, perhaps a god of fortune. Sun amulets were widespread as cultic ornaments. A tree cult was also maintained. Whatever was struck by lightning, man or object, was considered a sacrifice to the high god of heaven. The afterlife, to judge from excavations of aristocratic tumuli, was much a continuation of life on earth, warriors being interred with their weapons, horses, and sometimes with human sacrifices. The funeral of one Tudun in 711 saw 300 soldiers killed to accompany him to the other world. Ancestor worship was observed as well. The key religious figure appears to have been a shaman like Kam, and it was these Khans that were, according to the Khazar Hebrew conversion stories, driven out. Many sources suggest, and a notable number of scholars have argued, that the charismatic Ashina clan played a germinal role in the early Khazar state, although Zuckerman dismisses the widespread notion of their pivotal role as a phantom, or a powerless king. The Ashina were closely associated with the Tengri cult, whose practices involved rites performed to assure a tribe of heaven's protective providence. The Kagan, or the elder king of the Ashina clan, was deemed to rule by virtue of Kut, the heavenly mandate, or good fortune to rule. Christianity. Khazaria long served as a buffer state between the Byzantine Empire and both the nomads of the northern steppes and the Umayyad Empire of the Arabs, after having served as Byzantium's proxy against the Sasanian Persian Empire. The alliance was dropped around the year 900. The Byzantines began to encourage the Alans to attack Khazaria and weaken its hold on Crimea and the Caucasus, while seeking to obtain an entente with the rising Rus power to the north, which it aspired to convert to Christianity. On Khazaria's southern flank, both Islam and Byzantine Christianity were proselytizing great powers. Byzantine success in the north was sporadic, although Armenian and Albanian missions from Derbent built churches extensively in maritime Dagestan, then a Khazar district. Buddhism also had exercised an attraction on leaders of both the eastern and western kaganates, the latter being the progenitor of the Khazar state. In 682, according to the Armenian chronicle of Moses Orenatsi, the king of Caucasian Albania, Varas Terdat, dispatched a bishop, Israel, to convert Caucasian Huns, who were subject to the Khazars, and managed to convince Alp Iluer, a son-in-law of the Khazar Khagan, and his army to abandon their shamanizing cults and join the Christian fold. The Arab Georgian martyr, Saint Abo, who converted to Christianity within the Khazar kingdom around 779, describes local Khazars as irreligious. Some reports register a Christian majority at Samandar, or Muslim majorities. Islam. In 965, as the Khaganate was struggling against the victorious campaign of the Rus prince Sviatoslav, the Islamic historian Ibn al-Athir mentions that Khazaria, attacked by the Oghuz, sought help from Khwarezm, but their appeal was rejected because they were regarded as infidels, al-Kufr, pagans. Save for the king, the Khazarians are said to have converted to Islam in order to secure an alliance, and the Turks were, with Khwarezm's military assistance, repelled. It was this that, according to Ibn al-Athir, led the Jewish king of Khazar to convert to Islam. Judaism. Conversion to Judaism is mentioned in the Khazar correspondence and medieval external sources. The authenticity of the former was long doubted and challenged, but the documents are now widely accepted by specialists as either authentic or as reflecting internal Khazar traditions. Conversion of steppe or peripheral tribes to a universal religion is a fairly well-attested phenomenon, and the Khazar conversion to Judaism, also unusual, would not have been without precedent. There exists a Khazar coin, a so-called sheleg, minted circa the year 800, which shows an Arabic inscription with the meaning of Moses is the prophet of God. This is an obvious affront to the Arab Muslim tradition, which usually holds the inscription of Muhammad is God's prophet. Jews from both the Islamic world and Byzantium are known to have migrated to Khazaria during periods of persecution under Heraclius, Justinian II, Leo III, and Romanus Lekapenos. For Simon Schama, Jewish communities from the Balkans and the Bosporan Crimea, especially from Pantikapaum, began migrating to the more hospitable climate of pagan Khazaria in the wake of these persuasions. For Simon Schama, Jewish communities from the Balkans and the Bosporan Crimea, especially from Pantikapaum, began migrating to the more hospitable climate of pagan Khazaria in the wake of these persecutions, and were joined there by Jews from Armenia. The Geniza fragments, he argues, make it clear the Judaizing reforms sent roots down into the whole of the population. The pattern is one of an elite conversion preceding large-scale adoption of the new faith by the general population, which often resisted initially. One important condition for mass conversion was a settled urban state, where churches or synagogues or mosques provided a focus for religion, as opposed to the free nomadic lifestyle on the nomadic open steppes. A tradition of the Iranian Judeo-Tats claims that their ancestors were responsible for the Khazar conversion, a legend traceable to the 16th century Italian rabbi Juda Moshato attributed it to Yitzhak Hasangari. Both the date of the conversion and the extent of its influence beyond the elite, often minimized in some scholarship, are a matter of dispute. But at some point between 740 and 920, the Khazar royalty and nobility appear to have converted to Judaism. In part, it is argued, perhaps to deflect competing pressures from Arabs and Byzantines to accept either Islam or Christianity. The conversion of the Khazars to Judaism is an emotionally charged topic in Israel, and two scholars, Moshe Gil and Shaul Stampfer, have challenged the authenticity of the medieval Hebrew documents and argue that the conversion of the Khazar elite to Judaism never happened. Historian Alex Feldman is critical of Stampfer and Gil's dismissal of overwhelming textual and archaeological evidence of Khazarian Judaism, though he agrees it is unlikely that Ashkenazim, or Northern European Jews, are descended from Khazarian Jews. He posits a middle ground which can simultaneously accept Khazarian Judaism and doubt the Khazar Ashkenazi descent theory advanced in dubious genetic studies. This is the History and Mythology channel. Please share, like and subscribe.